If you grew up in Britain, the chances are a Raleigh was your first taste of freedom. The name stamped on the frame of the chopper under the tree at Christmas, the bike that taught you to balance, to pedal, to fall off, and get back on. At its peak, Raleigh employed 7,000 workers in the largest bicycle factory the world had ever seen, and stamped its name across 140 countries. It survived 2 world wars when the works turned to munitions. It survived the depression that broke half its rivals. It survived the motorcar, foreign competition, a whole industry collapsing around it, and kept the Nottingham gates open through everything the 20th century could throw at it. And then, after more than 100 years of making, the factory went silent. How does a name that taught a nation to ride simply disappear? What really happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Man Who Was Told He Was Dying. Nottingham, in the last years of the 1800s, was a city of small workshops. Lace and hosiery and bicycles, made in back rooms and converted sheds by men who worked with their hands and expected their sons to do the same. There were something like 15 bicycle makers in the city alone. Most of them would be forgotten within a generation. One of them would not. His name was Frank Bowden, and when the story properly begins, he was supposed to be dying. Born in Exeter in 1848, he had gone out to the Far East as a young man and made himself rich on the Hong Kong stock market. Genuinely rich, the kind of money that buys a comfortable life and a long one. But the work had broken his health. By his late 30s, he was a wreck of a man, and the doctors, in the blunt fashion of the age, told him he had perhaps 6 months to live. They prescribed rest. They prescribed air. And on a visit to Harrogate, taking the waters like every other exhausted gentleman of means, Bowden was told to try cycling. It is easy now to miss how strange that advice was. The bicycle in the late 1880s was still a slightly disreputable machine, a young man's contraption, faintly dangerous, not the sort of thing a dying financier was expected to take up. But Bowden had seen a particular bicycle in a London shop window, a safety bicycle, 2 wheels of roughly equal size, chain-driven, far removed from the neck-breaking penny farthing. On the frame was stamped the name of the street where it had been built, Raleigh. He bought one, and instead of gently pedalling around a spa town, Frank Bowden did something closer to a resurrection. He rode, through France, through Italy, back across England. The man given 6 months rode himself healthy, and somewhere in those miles, a conviction took hold that would outlast him by more than a century, that this machine, this simple, liberating machine, was going to change how ordinary people lived. In the autumn of 1888, restored and certain, he went looking for the workshop that had built the thing that saved his life. What he found was tiny. 12 men, 3 bicycles a week, a firm with no real capital and no idea what it was sitting on. Frank Bowden was about to change that. Chapter 2. The Company on Raleigh Street. The workshop had started in 1885 on Raleigh Street, off the Alfreton Road. 2 men had set it up, Richard Morris Woodhead, a Nottingham man from Sherwood, and a Frenchman, Paul-Eugène Louis Angois. They made bicycles the slow way, by hand, a few at a time, and they named the machines after the street, because a name had to come from somewhere. Money arrived in the person of William Ellis, a financier out of the city's lace trade, who joined around 1886 and moved the operation into a former lace works on the adjoining Russell Street. It was still small. It was still fragile. 3 bicycles a week does not build an empire. Then Bowden walked through the door, the satisfied customer, the man who owed the place his life, and the man with money to spend. In December of 1888, he founded the Raleigh Cycle Company, buying out Ellis's share. The following January, it became a limited company, with a nominal capital of £20,000, half of it Bowden's own. He was not a passive investor. Within 3 years, he had taken a controlling interest, and by 1894, the founders were gone. Woodhead and Angois left the board, their names slipping quietly out of a story that had started with them. This was not sentiment. It was not cruelty either. It was the particular clarity of a man who had already stared down his own death and found it easier, afterwards, to make hard decisions. Bowden had glimpsed the future, and he intended to be its owner. His timing was extraordinary. The 1890s brought the great British bicycle boom, a sudden, almost hysterical national appetite for the machine. For the first time, a working man could own a form of transport that did not eat, did not tire, and did not need stabling. A young woman could travel unchaperoned across a county. The bicycle was freedom you could buy on the Never Never, and Britain wanted it by the 100,000. Bowden built for the wave. He understood something his rivals didn't, that the future belonged not to the man who made the finest bicycle by hand, but to the man who could make a good bicycle by the 1,000 and stand behind it. He plunged into expansion. He borrowed. He gambled the firm's stability on scale, again and again, in a way that would have terrified a more cautious owner. And it worked. By 1896, the little workshop that had turned out 3 machines a week was employing around 850 people and producing 30,000 cycles a year. Contemporaries were already describing it as the largest bicycle maker in the world. That is the first thing to understand about Raleigh. Before the chopper, before the Tour de France, before any of it, the ambition was total from almost the beginning. Frank Bowden did not want a good business. He wanted the biggest bicycle factory on earth, and by the turn of the century, he was close to having it. He would be made a baronet in 1915 for the firm's service in the Great War. He died at his home, Bestwood Lodge, in April of 1921, decades after the 6 months he'd been allotted. A man told he had half a year had built something that would stand for 100. But a factory needs more than ambition. It needs a reason to exist that its rivals cannot copy. And in 1902, Raleigh found one. Chapter 3. The Gear That Changed Everything. By then, Bowden had moved the whole enterprise to a purpose-built factory at Lenton, on the western edge of Nottingham, completed in 1896 on a site of 7.5 acres. It seemed vast at the time. It would come to seem like a modest beginning. The thing that made Raleigh unstoppable was not, in the end, the bicycle itself. It was what went inside the rear wheel. In 1902 came the Sturmey-Archer 3-speed hub gear, a small mechanical miracle that let a rider change gear without a mess of external chains and cogs, all of it sealed neatly inside the hub. It took its name from 2 men, Henry Sturmey, a journalist, and James Archer, an engineer. Though the honest truth, as it usually is with these things, is more tangled. The core of the mechanism owed a great deal to a Manchester engineer named William Raleigh, whose contribution the name has never quite acknowledged. Whatever its precise parentage, the hub gear changed everything. Suddenly a Raleigh wasn't just a bicycle. It was a bicycle with something the others didn't have, something patented, something the company made itself. The 3-speed hub, the AW model above all, became one of the most beloved pieces of engineering Britain ever produced. Well over 80 million of them would be sold around the world. There are sheds in this country where one is still turning, 100 years on, clicking through its gears exactly as it was built to. This was the pattern that would define Raleigh's golden century. It made everything itself. Not just the frame, but the gears, the spokes, the bottom brackets, the whole machine, from raw steel to finished bicycle, under Raleigh's own roofs. In an age of specialists and subcontractors, Raleigh was a world unto itself. By 1913, the boy who had started with 3 bicycles a week was once again, unambiguously, the largest bicycle manufacturer on the planet. 1,700 workers, 60,000 cycles a year. And then the world went to war, and the factory did what British factories did. It turned to munitions. In both world wars, the Lenton works made the machinery of conflict, rather than the machinery of freedom. In the second, bicycle output fell to something like 5% of what the place could do. The rest was fuses and fittings for a nation fighting for its life. Between the wars, the firm passed to Frank's son. Sir Harold Bowden took the chair on his father's death in 1921 and held it for the next 17 years, steering Raleigh through the depression that broke so many others. He was a different animal to his father, more polished, an Olympic official, a man of committees, but he had the same instinct for scale. Under Harold, Raleigh absorbed the cycle trademarks of its old rival, Humber, in 1932. It dabbled briefly, and not very successfully, in motorcycles and little 3-wheeled cars, a strange side road in its history that would eventually feed into the firm that became Reliant. It built itself a proper headquarters on Lenton Boulevard in 1931, the Howitt Building, designed by the Nottingham architect Thomas Cecil Howitt, a building handsome enough that it stands, listed and protected, to this day. In 1934, it became a public company. By 1938, it was turning out getting on for 500,000 bicycles a year. 500,000. From a shed of 3 a week. In 50 years. And the truly remarkable thing, the thing that makes what came later so hard to bear, is that Raleigh had not yet reached its peak. The best was still ahead. When the Second War ended, and a battered, rationed, exhausted Britain looked around for something to sell to the world, it found that it still had, sitting in Nottingham, the greatest bicycle factory that had ever existed. The world, it turned out, was hungry for bicycles, and Raleigh was ready. Chapter 4. The Cathedral at Lenton. Imagine standing at the gates of the Lenton Works on a weekday morning in the mid-1950s. The hooter has sounded, and out of the terraced streets of Radford and Lenton come the workers, thousands of them, on foot and on bicycles, of course, always on bicycles, a river of people flowing towards a factory that has swallowed the whole western side of the city. The site was 40 acres by then. Within a few years, after a £5 million expansion in 1957, it would swell to 64. It had its own roads, its own foundry, its own plating shops, its own paint lines. Everything the Victorians had built to make itself self-sufficient, the post-war company had built upon and multiplied, until the works was less a factory than a walled industrial town, breathing to the rhythm of the shift. The smell reached you before the gates did. Hot metal, first of all, the particular scorched iron tang of the machine shops, then cutting oil, thick and mineral, worked into the concrete of the floor over decades until the building itself seemed to sweat it. Paint and enamel and the sharp chemical bite of the plating baths, where steel went in dull and came out gleaming chrome. And under all of it, the smell of people, tea from the canteen urns, tobacco smoke, wet wool on a rainy morning, the accumulated human warmth of 7,000 bodies at work in one place. The sound was a physical thing. The stamping presses that punched components out of flat sheet, each one landing with a concussion you felt through the soles of your boots. The scream of the capstan lathes turning hub shells. The hiss of pneumatic tools, the endless rattle of the assembly tracks, the shouted half-conversations that workers learned to conduct at a pitch that cut through the din. A works like that has a hum that never fully stops. You stopped hearing it after your first week. You'd hear it again, in memory 40 years later. There was a young man on the capstan lathes in those years who would make the whole place immortal. His name was Alan Sillitoe, and he had worked at Raleigh before turning to writing. In 1958 he published a novel called Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and its hero, Arthur Seaton, was a Raleigh man, a Sturmey-Archer capstan lathe operator, working the same machines Sillitoe had worked, living for the wage packet and the weekend. When they filmed it in 1960, they shot part of it on the factory floor itself. For once, the men on screen turning the lathes were the men who actually turned them. That was the texture of the place, skilled, hard, dependable work, done by people who took a quiet pride in it. A capstan operator knew his machine the way a musician knows an instrument. A wheel builder could lace and true a wheel by feel, thumbing the spokes for tension, like a piano tuner. The plating shop men could tell you, by the look of the surface, whether a batch had spent the right number of seconds in the bath. And it was multi-generational. Fathers brought sons through those gates. Uncles found nephews a start. When the place finally closed, the average length of service among the workforce was 21 years, and for many it was double that, a whole working life spent inside the same walls. You did not leave Raleigh. Raleigh was where you were. The men on those lathes probably could not have told you the export figures, but they were the ones making the thing the whole world wanted. Every bicycle that left Lenton and crossed an ocean, every roadster loaded onto a ship for Lagos or Nairobi or Toronto, started as a length of steel in their hands. They were the summit of British bicycle making, and most of them thought it would simply go on forever. Why would they think otherwise? The order books were full. The world was buying, and Raleigh, in those years, was not merely a British success. It was one of the most dominant manufacturers of anything, anywhere on Earth. Chapter 5. The name on every frame. The export figures were staggering. In 1946, in the immediate wreckage of the war, Raleigh accounted for 95% of all the bicycles imported into the United States. Not most, nearly all. In 1951, annual production passed 1 million machines for the first time, and as much as 70% of them were sent overseas. In November of 1952, The Duke of Edinburgh himself came to Lenton to open a new extension, a measure of what the factory now meant to the nation's fortunes. But the true heartland of Raleigh's empire was Africa. The all-steel Raleigh Roadster, heavy, upright, near indestructible, fitted with the Sturmey-Archer hub and built to shrug off roads that barely deserved the name, became the definitive bicycle of colonial and post-colonial Africa. In East Africa, Raleigh held something like 85% of the market. The company opened a factory in Nigeria, selling around 200,000 cycles a year. Across a whole continent, a Raleigh simply meant a bicycle, the way a Hoover meant a vacuum cleaner. It was a name stamped onto the daily life of millions of people who would never see Nottingham. At home, the works reshaped the city that housed it, and in doing so, Raleigh became part of a story larger than bicycles. When the ships of the Windrush generation brought Caribbean workers to Britain, Nottingham's employers were not, at first, quick to hire them. A local activist named Oswald George Pow campaigned hard against the colour bar in the city's factories, and the pressure grew sharper when the Jamaican Premier, Norman Manley, raised the threat of an embargo. Raleigh changed its hiring policy. It went on to become the largest employer of black workers in Nottingham, and for a generation of Caribbean families, the Lenton Works was the place where a life in Britain was built. The wage that paid for the house, the pension, the children's schooling. That history very nearly vanished until people went looking for it. It survives now in oral history projects. The University of Nottingham's I Worked at Raleigh archive, with more than 50 recorded interviews, and Nottingham Black Archives, When We Worked at Raleigh. Listen to those voices, and you hear it plainly. Pride, hardship, belonging, and the particular dignity of skilled work done well. These were not passive people to be pitied. They were the people who built the thing. By the end of the 1950s, quality was reckoned to be at its very finest. A Raleigh Sports, a Raleigh Superbs. These were not cheap machines, and they were not meant to be. They were built to last a lifetime, and frequently did. Then, in 1960, came a decision that looked at the time like the crowning triumph, and reads now like the first turn of a key in a lock. The conglomerate Tube Investments bought Raleigh and folded into it the whole British Cycle Corporation. Phillips, Hercules, Norman, Sun, a clutch of famous old names. Overnight, T.I. Raleigh controlled roughly 75% of the entire British bicycle market. 3/4 of every bicycle sold in Britain now came, in effect, from one company. It was, by any measure, the summit of dominance. Raleigh had swallowed its rivals, cornered its home market, conquered its export markets, and stamped its name across half the world. There was nowhere left to climb. And that, precisely, is the danger. Because a company that owns 3/4 of a market has a great deal to defend and very little left to gain. It stops being a hunter. It becomes a landlord, collecting rent on a position it assumes is permanent. Nobody at Lenton was thinking that way, of course. They had one more golden decade ahead, and, as it happened, the products that would fix Raleigh in the memory of an entire nation for the rest of their lives. Chapter 6. The Summit. If you grew up in Britain in the 1970s, you did not need to be told what a Raleigh was. It was underneath you. In 1969, Raleigh launched a bicycle unlike anything it had made before, and unlike anything a child had ever wanted more. The Chopper, high-rise handlebars like a chopped American motorbike, a long padded seat with a chrome sissy bar behind it, a fat rear tyre, and even, on the early models, a gear lever mounted on the frame like the shift of a hot rod. It was drawn up largely by Raleigh's own designer, Alan Oakley, though, as with the Sturmey-Archer name, others would later press their own claim to the credit. It should not have worked. It was heavy. It was, by any sensible measure, a slightly impractical bicycle, and it was the most desirable object in Britain. It launched in America in '69 and in Britain in 1970, and through the decade that followed, it sold something like 1.5 million machines in the United Kingdom alone. To own a chopper was to be the envy of your street. To be given one at Christmas was a childhood memory that outlasted almost every other. Decades later, it would be voted one of the great British design icons, a piece of moulded steel and rubber that had lodged itself permanently in the national imagination. Then came the Grifter in 1976, chunkier and tougher for the older boy who had grown out of his chopper. And then, in 1982, the Burner, Raleigh's answer to the BMX craze that had crossed the Atlantic. The Burner range sold more than 1 million units and helped drive Raleigh back to something like half the entire British market. 1983 would be its best home sales year of the whole era, with close to 1 million bicycles sold in a single year. The pride was not only in the toys. In 1980, the professional TI Raleigh racing team, run by the formidable Dutch directeur sportif Peter Post, won the Tour de France. Their rider, Joop Zoetemelk, took the general classification by nearly 7 minutes, after the great favourite Bernard Hinault abandoned with a ruined knee. The team was ruthless that year. 11 stage wins, a feat not managed since. To this day, that TI Raleigh machine remains the only British-built bicycle ever to win the Tour de France. So there it stands. The Summit, a company that dominated its home market, clothed the world's cyclists, gave British children the defining possession of their youth, and put a British bicycle at the front of the greatest race on earth. In the early 1980s, if you had asked anyone in Nottingham whether Raleigh could ever fall, they would have looked at you as though you were simple. But the shadows were already there, for anyone who cared to look. The chopper and the burner were brilliant, and they were brittle. They were fashion, and fashion moves on. A bicycle built for a 7-year-old had nowhere to grow. When the child grew, the craze died, and there was nothing to sell him next. The youth boom was real, and it was also a sugar rush, spectacular and short. And further off, harder to see from inside a factory running at full tilt, something larger was stirring. Bicycles were beginning to arrive in Britain from abroad in numbers that had once been unthinkable. Cheaper machines. Then, soon, cleverer ones. The world that had made Raleigh giant, the captive home market, the protected export empire, the sheer scale that no rival could match, was quietly, decisively beginning to change. Nobody inside those walls, in 1982, could see the cliff. They were standing on the highest ground the company had ever occupied, watching 1 million burners fly out of the gates. It was the last time Raleigh would ever stand so high. Chapter 7. The Long Neglect. The trouble with owning 3/4 of a market is that the only direction left is down. But that is not, on its own, what undid Raleigh. Markets shrink and swell. A strong company rides it out. What hollowed Raleigh out was slower and quieter than any single collapse. It was neglect. 27 years of it. Start with the ground shifting under the whole industry. Between 1950 and 1962, British bicycle sales roughly halved. The reason was sitting on every new driveway in every new estate, the motor car. The utility cyclist, the working man who rode to the factory because he had no other way to get there, was buying a Ford or an Austin on hire purchase and leaving the bicycle in the shed. The bicycle was becoming a toy and a hobby rather than a necessity, and a company built to supply a nation's daily transport had to find a new reason to exist. At the same time, the export empire was crumbling from the far end. The newly independent nations of Africa and Asia, the captive markets that had bought roadsters by the 100,000, did what independent nations do. They put up tariff walls. They wanted their own industries, their own factories, their own jobs. A bicycle assembled in Nottingham and shipped halfway round the world could not compete with a bicycle assembled behind a customs barrier by local hands, and the young governments had every reason to prefer the second. The 85% share of East Africa did not vanish overnight. It bled away, one customs house at a time, one localization policy at a time, until the great imperial river of roadsters slowed to a trickle. There was nothing Nottingham could do about it, and this is the hard part. Nothing Nottingham should have expected to do about it. The protected world that had made Raleigh giant was simply being dismantled by people with a better right to the ground than a Nottingham export ledger. And into this fragile moment came Tube Investments, the conglomerate that had bought Raleigh in 1960. Here is the quiet tragedy at the centre of the whole story. Not a villain, but an indifference. TI was a sprawling industrial group. It made Credder cookers and Russell Hobbs kettles and Tower saucepans. Bicycles were one division among many, and by most accounts, TI did not find them interesting. Not glamorous. Not, in the language of the boardroom, a growth area. So TI did the thing that slowly kills a great manufacturer. It declined to invest. There is one detail that says everything. In 1973, the Sturmey-Archer engineers, the inheritors of the greatest hub gear ever made, designed a 7-speed hub. It worked, it was ready, and TI would not fund it, so it sat in a drawer. When a 7-speed hub finally reached the market, more than 20 years later, the world had moved on, and the makers who owned that ground were German and Japanese, Sachs and Shimano. Raleigh had invented the future of the hub gear in 1973 and then been forbidden, by its own owner, to build it. Think about what that means for the men in the gear division. These were the descendants, in craft if not in blood, of the people who had made the AW hub the most trusted piece of engineering in world cycling. They had drawn the next great thing, and they had watched it locked away, not because it failed, but because the men who owned them could not see the point of spending the money. Nothing corrodes a great workforce faster than being told, in effect, that their best work is not worth building. The names changed through those years, a succession of managing directors, Leslie Roberts, Tom Barnsley, Ian Phillips, Rowley Jarvis, Bob Ing, each running the division inside the limits TI set for them. None of them was a fool, none of them was the villain of the piece, but the pattern does not change from one to the next. A division starved of capital cannot fight on quality, so it competes on price, and on price it will always, eventually, lose to someone whose costs are lower, and there were plenty of those someones now. In 1970, imports of foreign bicycles into Britain were around 27,000 machines, 4% of the market, a rounding error, nothing to lose sleep over. Within 5 years, they were 9 times that. By 1981, for the first time in the company's long history, imports overtook exports. Read that again, because it is the whole tragedy in a single fact. The country that had sold the world its bicycles was now buying more bicycles from abroad than it sold to it. The tide had not merely slowed, it had reversed, and it would never turn back. Under TI's long stewardship, Raleigh's share of the British market fell from that towering 75% to 36%. It had lost half of everything, not in a crash, not in a scandal, but in a slow, managed erosion that nobody quite decided upon and nobody ever quite stopped. A great company was being lowered, year by year, into a grave that no single hand had dug. This is the part of the story that gets forgotten in favour of a simpler tale, because there is a simpler tale, and it involves a bicycle from California. Chapter 8. Who Needs Mountains in England? In the hills of Marin County, north of San Francisco, in the middle 1970s, a handful of young men were doing something stupid and wonderful. They were taking old balloon-tired bicycles. Clunkers, they called them, hauling them up a mountain called Tamalpais and racing them back down a fire road so brutal it burned the grease out of the hubs. They called the race Repack for exactly that reason. Out of that came a new kind of bicycle. Joe Breeze built the first purpose-made frames in 1977. Gary Fisher and Charlie Kelly started a company to sell them. And in 1981, a man named Mike Sinyard and his firm Specialized launched the Stump Jumper, the first mass-produced mountain bike, built in Japan, sold complete for around $750. It is in the Smithsonian now. It changed cycling more completely than anything since the safety bicycle itself. Somebody at Raleigh saw it coming. Her name was Yvonne Ricks. Ricks had joined Raleigh back in 1962 as secretary to the chief designer, Alan Oakley, the man who drew the chopper. She had risen through the company on ability and instinct, not on connections, and she had the rarest quality a person can have inside a dominant firm. She was still capable of being surprised. In 1981, she travelled to the United States and the Far East, and she came home certain. Mountain bikes, she argued, were not a novelty for a handful of Californians. They would come down off the hills and onto the streets. People would buy them who never went within 50 miles of a mountain. This was where cycling was going, and Raleigh needed to be there when it arrived. The board's response has been preserved by the cycle historian Tony Hadland in a paper he gave to an international conference of bicycle historians in the year 2000, and it is the single best documented scene in the whole decline. The board asked, in effect, who needs mountain bikes in England where there are few mountains? Ricks's answer was perfect. She told them that you didn't need a 4x4 to drive in London either, and yet you saw plenty of Range Rovers in Chelsea. She was right. Of course she was right, but she was one voice, and the board was the board, and a board that has owned 3/4 of its market for 20 years has learned to trust its own judgment above the reports of a woman just back from America. So, Raleigh waited, and it was not the first time that culture had cost them. It was the second, because the very same instinct had already misfired once, a few years earlier, over a bicycle for children. When the BMX craze crossed the Atlantic, the board was reluctant there too. They hoped, the record shows, that BMX would prove a passing fad. It did not. It became the Burner, and the Burner sold more than 1 million machines. But Raleigh had come to it late and grudgingly, and the reluctance had a price beyond lost sales. There were, in Hadland's careful phrase, some high-level sackings. Men lost their jobs for having read the board's own scepticism back to it and got it wrong, and there was a crueler price still, paid by the very division that had made Raleigh great. A BMX bike has no hub gear. It is a single-speed machine, stripped for jumping and racing. So every child who chose a Burner over a traditional geared bicycle was, without knowing it, a customer lost to Sturmey-Archer. In 1982, as the BMX boom hollowed out demand for the hub gear, Sturmey-Archer made 400 workers redundant. The proudest name in the whole enterprise, the engineering that had beaten the world, shedding 400 jobs because children now wanted a bicycle that used none of what it made. There is a bitter symmetry in it. The youth boom that looked from the outside like Raleigh triumphant was, on the inside, already eating the company's oldest strength. So when the board asked who needs mountain bikes in England, it was not an isolated blunder. It was a habit. It was the same voice that had hoped BMX would go away, the same voice that had left the 7-speed hub in a drawer. And Raleigh did not launch a mountain bike in Britain until the spring of 1985. When it finally came, the Maverick, it was built in the old Raleigh way, with traditional brazed roadster-style joints, by people who did not yet quite believe in the thing they were making. It did not sell well. Here is where the popular story wants to end. Arrogant British suits sneer at a brilliant American idea, refuse to build it, and destroy the company overnight through sheer stubbornness. One fatal mistake. It is a satisfying story. It is also not what happened, because the truth is stranger and sadder. Raleigh was late to the mountain bike, genuinely, damagingly late. But it did not miss it. After the company changed hands in 1987, Raleigh threw itself into mountain bikes at last, and rode the boom hard. Its sales rose 4 years running. In the end, it would sell more than 3 million mountain bikes. It even, in 1991, effectively invented a whole new category, the hybrid, the pioneer, a road and rough machine for the rider who wanted a bit of both, and it sold in enormous numbers. Raleigh even claimed, with some justice, to have been the first major British maker to market a mountain bike at all. So the mountain bike refusal was not the single blow that felled the giant. It was something more revealing than that. It was a symptom. The board that asked, who needs mountain bikes in England, was the same board, in the same culture, that had hoped BMX would go away and left the 7-speed hub unbuilt. The disease was never one bad decision about one product. The disease was a company that had forgotten how to believe in the future. A company so long accustomed to owning its world that it could no longer imagine that world changing without its permission. Yvonne Ricks lost that argument in 1981 and won it too late, a few years on. She would go on to become marketing director under the new owners, but by then, the thing she had seen so clearly was no longer Raleigh's to command. The future of the bicycle was being decided in California and Taiwan, and Nottingham was running to catch up. Chapter 9. The owners. For the rest of its life, Raleigh would belong to a succession of people who had bought it rather than built it. This is the part of the story that resists a simple villain, because there wasn't one. There was a chain of reasonable men making reasonable decisions, each of which moved the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it. By 1987, Tube Investments had run out of patience with the division it had never loved. On the 1st of April that year, TI sold Raleigh to a company registered in Luxembourg, Derby International, for £18 million, plus another £14 million of assumed debt. Derby had been put together by an Anglo-American tax lawyer named Edward Gottesman. Because the banks wanted a proven operator at the helm rather than a lawyer, a former Dunlop-Slazenger executive called Alan Finden Crofts was brought in to run it. And here is the fact that ought to bury the one fatal mistake myth for good. For a while, it worked. Finden Crofts arrived and cut away a whole layer of the old TI management, the very people who had presided over the long neglect. Freed at last to spend money and chase the market, Derby caught the mountain bike boom that TI had been too timid to touch. It bought the German maker Kalkoff in 1988. It grew, and by 1992, Derby was the largest cycle group in the world, turning over something close to $500 million. In 1999, it swallowed the American brand Diamondback. This is the cruel irony at the heart of everything. In the years immediately after the supposedly fatal error, Raleigh was not dying. It was thriving. But thriving is not the same as safe, and the ground beneath the whole industry had never stopped moving. The manufacturing was going east, first Japan, then Taiwan, where a company called Giant grew from quietly building other people's bicycles into a colossus building its own. Then China, then Vietnam and Bangladesh. Each move east dropped the price of a bicycle a little further, and each drop made a bicycle built by a well-paid worker in Nottingham a little harder to justify on a spreadsheet. Derby could win the boom. It could not win the arithmetic. And now the ownership began to churn in earnest, and with each change of hands, the company drifted a little further from the people who actually made things. In 1998, a group of New York investors, the private equity firms Thayer Capital and Perseus among them, bought the business. Find and Crofts, who had built Derby up, sold out and stepped away. The men who now owned the largest cycle group in the world had never brazed a frame or trued a wheel. To them, quite understandably, Raleigh was not a craft. It was an asset to be improved and, in time, sold on. And then came the decision that people in Nottingham would single out, ever after, above all the others. In 1999, Derby, now under an American chief executive named Gary Matthews, sold the Triumph Road factory site to the University of Nottingham. They sold the ground out from under the company without first securing anywhere else to make bicycles. One local account called it, simply, disastrous, and it is hard to argue. That December, the frame-making machinery, the heavy plant that turned steel tube into Raleigh frames, the very heart of what the company physically was, went under the hammer at auction. Around 50 jobs went with it. Volume frame building in Nottingham, after more than a century, was over. Not with a ceremony, not with a speech, with an auctioneer's gavel and a car park full of tooling waiting to be carted away. Then they came for the crown jewel. In December of 2000, the assets and trademarks of Sturmey-Archer, the hub gear that had made Raleigh unbeatable, 80 million of them turning in the world's wheels, were sold off. The details are murky, and reports differ. There was a bungled sale to a small British investment firm for a nominal sum, and then the name and the tooling ended up with Sunrace of Taiwan, where they remain. The greatest name in British cycle engineering became a Taiwanese brand. It still exists. It is simply no longer ours. Somewhere in Taiwan, machines still stamp out hubs to a design descended from a Nottingham workshop, and the workers who made that design great grew old in a city that no longer makes it. By now, Derby itself was in trouble. Money was pouring out faster than it came in, and the group turned, as troubled companies do, to the financiers of last resort. Around this time, the American investor George Soros, through his Quantum Fund, among others, put something like £21 million of rescue funding into Derby. It was not enough. You cannot buy your way out of a cost base that a factory in Bangladesh will always beat, and rescue money spent against that tide is water poured into sand. The end, when it came fast. On the 20th of August, 2001, Derby Cycle filed for bankruptcy protection in the United States. To keep the creditors from the door, the group sold off its jewel, the profitable Dutch arm Gazelle, for something like €142 million. And then Alan Finden Crofts came back, one last time, leading a management buyout that bought Derby's assets out of the wreckage and renamed the company Raleigh Cycle Limited. He took a 42% stake. The deal was announced in the autumn of 2001 and completed, depending on which account you read, either then or in October of 2002. Raleigh, the company, would survive all of this. In 2012, it would be bought by the Dutch Axel Group for around £62 million. The year before, it had sold 850,000 bicycles and turned over some €200 million. Axel's chief executive, René Takens, welcomed a strong and global brand into the fold, and he was right to. The name did not die. The name is still with us. But the factory was another matter entirely, and by the spring of 2002, a man named Philip Darnton had a decision to make about it. A decision that no amount of rescue money, No change of owner, no clever restructuring could any longer put off. Chapter 10. The Last Wheel. Philip Darnton was the executive chairman, a man who had come to bicycles from Unilever and from Reckitt and Coleman, from soap and household goods, the world of brands and margins and market share. He was not a cartoon asset stripper. He was a man looking at a spreadsheet that would only ever give one answer. On the 11th of March, 2002, the 12-member Raleigh executive decided to end bicycle assembly in the United Kingdom by the close of the year. 280 assembly jobs would go, including that of Steve White, the factory manager, whose job it was, at the last, to manage the closing of his own factory. From 2003, around 100 office and warehouse staff would handle the sales and design and importing of some 300,000 bicycles a year, every one of them boxed and shipped, complete, from the Far East. Darnton did not hide behind euphemism, and it is only fair to let him make his own case, because he was not wrong about the numbers. He blamed a price fight. Chinese bicycles, he pointed out, carried a duty of 45.6% against them, and imports had still risen by 150% in a single year. There were countries with no tariff at all, he said. Bangladesh, Vietnam. Some suppliers were undercutting Nottingham by as much as a quarter. Building a new assembly plant in Britain, he concluded, could no longer be financially justified. Every word of that was true. That is what made it unanswerable and unbearable. There had been one last hope, and it deserves to be remembered, because of how small and how strange it was. A plan to move production to a new plant on allotment land at Bulwell. It was blocked, partly by a small group of allotment holders who would not give up their ground, and partly by protected wildlife living on the site. The local Member of Parliament, Graham Allen, called it the straw that broke the camel's back. And there is the ending, in miniature and in full. The world's largest bicycle factory, 100 years of it, brought to a final standstill over an allotment and a nesting bird. The other Nottingham member, Alan Simpson, found the truer words for what it meant. This, he said, was not so much a factory closure as a bereavement. That is exactly how it felt to the people inside. Dave Timpson, the GMB union steward, 51 years old and 30 years on the payroll, put it in the plain, unshowy way of a man absorbing a blow. It had come as a shock, he said, and now it was just a question of seeing it through as smoothly as possible, to the very end. There is a whole world of British working dignity in that sentence. The refusal to make a scene, the determination to do the job properly, even when the job is switching off the lights on your own life's work. For the long service men, the disbelief was the hardest part of it. Ivan Lowe, 50 years old, 25 of them at Raleigh, called it a bombshell. Nobody had expected the closure, he said. He had assumed he would be there until he retired. John Wingfield, 55, another 25-year man, found the sorrow of it in the ordinary dependability now being taken away. It was a hard job, he said, but it was a dependable one. That was the wound. Not that the work was easy, it never had been, but that it had been there, reliable, generation after generation, a thing a man could build a life around. And now it would not be. The last bicycle component came off the Nottingham line at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of Thursday, the 28th of November, 2002. It was not a chopper, it was not a tour-winning racer. It was a 20-inch wheel for a child's bicycle, a Little Max, and it was made by a wheel worker named Barry Wheat. More than 100 years of Nottingham bicycle making ended in his hands, with a child's wheel. There were no television cameras. A reporter from the Nottingham Evening Post was there to witness it, and recorded that soon many of the last 280 employees were starting the first leg of a pub crawl around Radford, and that the place, he wrote, had the feeling of the Marie Celeste. A works built for the noise and heat and movement of thousands, emptying out quietly into the November dark. One of the wheelmakers, Claudette Green, was clear-eyed about how little the moment was marked. It shouldn't have been so low-key, she said. Raleigh had been a big part of Nottingham for 100 years. Everybody, she said, had a sister, a mam or a dad who'd worked there. That was the truest measure of the place, not the export figures, not the market share, that there was scarcely a family in the west of the city that did not have someone inside those walls, that the closing of Raleigh was not the closing of a business, but the ending of something woven through the blood of a city. Alan Sillitoe, the lathe operator who had made the factory immortal in fiction, half a century before, was still alive to see it close. Raleigh, he said, had been a kind of soul of Nottingham, and he was very sad about it. Chapter 11. The Lake, where the factory stood. Walk the ground now, and you would never know. The buildings came down in 2003. The site was cleared, and in its place rose the University of Nottingham's Jubilee campus, a handsome thing, honestly, designed by the architects of Michael Hopkins and Partners, arranged around a long serpentine lake fed by the little River Leen. It houses the business school and the schools of education and computer science. Its roofs are planted with sedum. It has won awards for sustainability. The Queen opened its first phase in 1999, while the last Raleigh frames were still being made a few hundred yards away. The future built alongside the past for a year or two, before the past was cleared to make room. There is a particular kind of silence in a place like that. Not emptiness. The campus is full of students, of life, of purpose. But it is the wrong life, in the wrong shape. Where there was the concussion of the stamping presses, there is the murmur of a seminar. Where 7,000 workers once poured through the gates on their bicycles in the grey of a winter morning, there are undergraduates crossing a footbridge over ornamental water. It is not a ruin. It is something stranger than a ruin. It is an erasure so complete and so pleasant that you could stand by that lake on a summer afternoon and never once suspect that the largest bicycle factory the world had ever seen had breathed and hammered and sweated on that exact ground. Virtually nothing of it remains. The Howitt building, the handsome old headquarters on Lenton Boulevard, still stands a little way off, listed and protected, a single fragment of the empire, kept because someone thought to list it. But the works themselves are gone as though they had never been. No chimney, no gate, no hooter to sound the shift. A lake where the foundry stood. The name survives, after its fashion. Raleigh belongs to the Dutch Axel Group now, and Raleigh bicycles are still sold. Good ones, made in the Far East. The name licensed in some countries to firms with no connection to Nottingham at all. The modern British operation moved to Eastwood and then to Mansfield. Sturmey-Archer lives on as a Taiwanese brand, its hubs still turning in wheels all over the world. Its heritage now somebody else's inheritance. A child today can still be given a Raleigh for Christmas, exactly as their grandparents were, and feel exactly the same joy. It is simply not made by the same hands, in the same city, and everyone in Nottingham knows it. What is left, in the end, is memory, and the people who took the trouble to save it before it went. The university's I Worked at Raleigh project, with its more than 50 recorded interviews, Nottingham Black Archives, When We Worked at Raleigh, holding the voices of the Caribbean families who built their British lives inside those gates, the choppers behind glass in the city's museums, the recorded voices of the men and women who worked those lathes and laced those wheels, telling a city what it used to be, so that when the last of them is gone, the knowing will not go with them. Chapter 12. What the silence keeps. So was it one mistake? No. And the truth is heavier than the myth. The story we are sold is clean and comforting in its way, that a great company was killed in a single stroke of arrogance, that a boardroom of fools sneered at a mountain bike and paid for it with everything. It lets us believe that decline is a single wrong turn, avoidable, foreseeable, the fault of identifiable idiots. If only they had listened to Yvonne Ricks. If only they had built the mountain bike in 1981 instead of 1985. But Raleigh did build the mountain bike, and it sold 3 million of them. The refusal cost it a lead. It did not cost it its life. What actually killed the factory was slower and sadder and far harder to rage against, because there is no one in it to hate. It was the car in every driveway that made the utility bicycle obsolete. It was the newly free nations that quite reasonably wanted their own factories rather than Nottingham's. It was 27 years of a conglomerate that found bicycles boring and would not spend the money to keep them great. It was a 7-speed hub left in a drawer for 20 years and 400 gear makers made redundant because children wanted a bike with no gears, and a factory site sold before anyone had secured a new one, and the greatest name in British cycling sold off to Taiwan, and rescue millions poured against a tide that could not be turned, and at the very last, a price that no British worker could ever be paid little enough to beat. It was, in the final reckoning, an allotment. Frank Bowden was told he had 6 months to live and he built a thing that stood for 114 years in Nottingham. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the depression that broke half its rivals. It clothed the world's cyclists and gave a nation's children the defining possession of their youth, and put a British bicycle at the very front of the greatest race on earth. And then it did not survive peace and prosperity, and cheaper competitors, and a chain of owners who never loved it. It was not murdered. It was outlived by the world that had made it giant, a world of empire and captive markets, and a whole nation that rode to work, all of it quietly slipping away, while the presses still hammered on at Lenton, and the men on the lathes still believed it would go on forever. The last thing the factory ever made was a wheel for a child's bicycle. There is something almost unbearable in the fitness of that. A company that began with a dying man riding himself back to life ended with a small wheel, built by hand, for someone just learning to ride. The whole story, from the first turn of the pedals to the last, was about that one simple machine and the freedom it gave, and about the thousands of people in one corner of one city who gave their working lives to making it, and who deserved a louder goodbye than a quiet November afternoon and a pub crawl through Radford. Stand by the lake now. Watch the students cross the water, and know that beneath all that still, ornamental calm, 7,000 people once made the world's bicycles, and were proud of it, and are gone.